Howdy hackers and welcome to another episode of FairLight TV. This time we're going to look at disk drives for the C64 and 128 and plus 4 and the Commodore 16. Yeah, well, in 8-bit Commodore machines, the storage devices for the media, and then we will fork off in a number of different directions from there. It will start with the actual disk drives developed by Commodore. They were, of course, third-party variants of those. I will not show you any of those, even if they were rather interesting, a few of them. But so that's the disk drive part, and then we would look at the how they work and also the communication and a little around emulation and yeah, a lot around that. So yeah. Let's first move over to this. So, there are a number of sort of default drives that Commodore produced, and this one was supposed to be compatible between the C64 and the VIC-20, and the first one that came out was this, the 1540, so that one was compatible with both. It's very kind of, the aesthetics is very VIC-20, the color is VIC-20, the dark blue, the dark brown here is also the VIC-20. My first disk drive was very much like this one. It was called 1541, but it had the same white and it had the same brown. Are they good? No. So the issue with these is that they got serious heating problems, and the serious heating problem resulted in the drive going out of alignment. There is this init thing that it bangs the head like dang 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 when you turn the drive on, and if you do that a lot and also a number of the protections that were on the platform made the disk drive go out of alignment. And like the azimuth on tape, if you've written a disk based on sort of erroneous alignment, it was very hard to read back. So I would recommend you to buy one of those disk drives if your intention is to have it on a shelf for display purposes. If you're going to use it, a disk drive as your daily driver, do not buy this one, okay? Do not buy this one. Let's move over to the other one. So the standard 1541, you see the squeeze kind of mechanism here for locking the disk in. I can show you the other one where you have the little turn lever here. So these two are the same, and if you look at them, it's like the C64. There are a number of variants of the motherboard of these, but they had basically the same sort of functionality. They could easily overheat if they were running too much, but it was a lot more stable than the white one previously. And especially this one with the turn closing mechanism is really stable, and I would recommend that any day because they are stable over time. If you look at the reference drive for ensuring that whatever you do is compatible, this is the drive you should have, because that is sort of the super compatible. It's sort of the reference for what is compatible and what is not. Yeah, and then we go into this one. So the C64 came out in a C64C, which had this beige kind of color, and also the very dark brown was sort of surrendered in favor of this gray. Yeah, and thank you to whoever had the picture online. This is something I've taken from somebody, so thanks for borrowing that to me, even if you weren't aware. It's a really filthy example because yeah, it's that one needs a lot of retrobiting and cleaning up, I can tell you, if you look at the details of this one. But looking at the disk drive now, this one is also something I do not recommend as your daily driver if you're going to have something that runs like native stuff on the C64. It's more stable than the previous ones. It's less prone for sort of overheating. And let's just pause for a second and talk about the disk drive. It has a CPU, the 6502, basically the same variant. It's a different variant, but still sort of the same processor as the C64 itself. It goes at 1 megahertz exactly. It doesn't change depending on if it's PAL or NTSC as the computer is. And it has a little bit of RAM. It's like 2K, 2K. So it's really, really limited, but for its own internal purposes, it doesn't need anything more than that. So there was no point in adding any more RAM in the disk drive. Of course, it doesn't have any VIC chip because there is no sort of video output. It doesn't have any SID chip because there is no sound output. But it has 2 timer chips. And one of the common modifications of the setup, the communication between the C64 and its disk drive was adding a parallel cable. And this one, you could not do that. I should show you this. I've had a reference. I've been referencing this a number of times, so I'm not sure if you could sort of see here. In here, there is this little hole. And there is also a hole on the physical media, and on most systems there is sort of except for the C64, on most systems there is sort of a diode that lights through here, and when there is a blink, the drive mechanism knows exactly where on the disk, where on the revelation of the actual surface you are. But the C64 normally doesn't, it doesn't use that. It's not supported in the previous DOS. This one has one of those sensors, and that is connected to one of the data pins on one of the timer chips, which is the same 8-bit data port that is commonly used for parallel communication on the C64. So if you want to add a parallel cable, this is not the drive you should get, because it cannot be sort of modified. Well, unless you make bigger modifications than that. So if you want to add like a parallel port easily, don't get this one. I mean, as a drive, it's absolutely fine. It's reasonably compatible, but due to this sort of hardware change, it's not fully compatible. So again, this is probably not the one you're looking for. Then they came out with this, the 1541-2. Here, I mean, the mechanics is sort of the same. The drive logistics, the logical board, the board is sort of the same, but they move the power supply to outside of the disk drive, which sort of eliminates the heating problems that the previous generations had. So, yeah. A very good option for a daily driver if you have somewhere where you can put the the power supply. So it takes less screen estate, desk estate as well. So I mean, for most purposes, this one is absolutely fine. Again, a really filthy disk drive, but this is a 1541, and this is sort of the Rolls Royce. If you want a disk drive for your Commodore and you're not going to install a parallel cable, because this is also a bit messy in this one, this is what you want. And I will get back to other interfaces and give additional resources why you would want this one. I have my own 1571 here. This is how they should look if they're reasonably clean. It's big. It's a lot bigger than the 1541-2, but it's sort of the same form factor. So if you just look at pictures, it might be difficult to tell which one is which. But so the 1571 supports dual side reading and writing. There was a version with basically the same form factor that was 1570. Yeah, it is the same form factor. I think I've never seen one in real life, so I'm not really sure. And it's probably also one you would only want for kind of display purposes. But so the 1570 was single-sided, but basically the same. Apart from that, the 1571 being two-sided. Yeah, let's go through that. It supports a mode called SQR, SRQ, SQR, I think it is. which makes it faster, especially if you load from the C128. The kernel there supports this faster loading mode. And if you're going to rip disks using one of the interfaces towards a PC or a Linux or a Macintosh machine, this is the drive you would like. The 1571 can read protected disks at faster speed, and it can also help you rip your standard DOS disks faster than basically anything else. You don't need a parallel interface. You run like full speed on the serial interface if you have a 1571. So you want a 1571 if you're going to rip disks. Yes. Other things. Okay, so the Ultimate, the 1541 Ultimate. So this is a utility cartridge. It's like a standard action replay utility cartridge, but enhanced. And this is the enhancement. You plug this in at the normal serial port, like so. And then this one emulates a 1541. Using the GUI, which you access using one of the buttons, you can select the D64, so a disk image, and then this one acts as a disk drive. And you really don't need one of those bulky disk drives, because this one, using a standard SD card, you can store basically any number of... I mean, if you look at the 170K of a disk, and you look at the sort of terabytes that you can store on SD, it's quite easy to compute that you can store all software ever produced on the C64 on the same USB stick. So you would have access to that using this without having a physical disk drive that would sort of steal your disk estate. Super good. This takes your computing to the next level. It makes everything so much easier. And this one supports, I think it's audio out and more USB, so you can connect other things to it. This one also has a LAN port. So if you're using Assembly 64, which is sort of a collection program for the platform, you can just double-click a D64 and it would send in the a disk image over the LAN port, and it would execute that as well. So a super handy way of kind of remote populating your native machine with a D64 that you would like to test. Yeah, super good, super good. Yeah, and then we have this, and sorry for the green screen effect. This one is yellow. It's a turbo Chameleon. This is the generation 1. There is a generation 2 of it, and so it is yellow. It's supposed to be yellow, but the green screen effect is killing that, so it looks, yeah, something else. And as you see here, the section here is the standard cartridge. I have it in one of those boards that allows you to connect four joysticks to it. Rather than having like multiple ports, it has this little port which is sort of its own, and then it has a number of like breakout cables. So the thing with this one is, if you're using it on the C64, it's sort of taking over the entire machine. You are basically only using the keyboard of the C64, and the machine, the C64 running, is this one. An advantage of this is that you would have here on the top there is an RGB port, which means that you can connect an external monitor to this one, which is more compatible, of course, than it's easier than finding something which is a flat panel that supports the default output from the C64. So yeah, clear advantage, but it's of course less compatible because, again, it's not like really the C64 that runs, it's this one that runs, and it becomes only as compatible as this is. It emulates a disk drive, it emulates the PC or the computer itself, but one of the facts is that you can then run it independently. So that's sort of the setup I have here. You connect... what is it? The green one is keyboard and one is mouse. I don't remember which is which. they are looking basically the same. But so you connect an external keyboard, a standard keyboard, PS2, I think this port is called, and then a standard mouse. And then you can run the interfaces, the interface using no C64 involved at all. So if you're going to copy parties, this could be the thing that you're bringing. So you need a monitor and you need this. You don't need the actual computer, because then you have all your data on the SD card and you have this being your C64. I don't really remember if this one is for powering it. It might very well be. So if so, then this would be everything you needed for adding the power to it. And then you can have a real external disk drive using this one. Yeah, I never use this because I have an Ultimate 64, which is sort of the big brother of this one. It's the new motherboard for that you just put inside an old shell, so it becomes a full new C64, FPGA based. Okay, the next thing would be, how are you going to access native drives from other system? And other system, you know, like the bigger system, the Linuxes, the Windows and the PC and the Macintosh. And that will be something like this. XUM, I think, is sort of the standard, and this is an XUM. This one is the one you are likely going to kind of bump into will be a Zoom floppy. It's sort of XUM, but pronounced slightly differently, and then it's spelled ZOOM. This one is compatible with the Zoom, but the form factor is significantly much smaller, and it's taken away a lot of the rather massive PCB estate and put things more compactly. It's fully compatible. You normally install something called OpenCBM on your machine, and which is talking to this one. So that is sort of the interface between programs and talking over the USB port to this particular unit. Yeah, so everybody should have like one of those, and this particular version is the one done by Björn Hutmacher, Swedish guy who produces those. Okay, and so the other option, and now we're moving more into not something you can have like your daily driver towards the, if you're running a C64, but more like if you're going to rip your disks. And I've shown you these before, the Turbo, the SuperCard Pro, which again, I think is sort of the lamest name ever, but yeah, SuperCard Pro. And the CryoFlux, which is also one of those interfaces. And this one I haven't even opened. It's a Grease Weasel. So these are cards produced by a company, well, of course, two different companies, and then they are produced and sold. Whereas the Grease Weasel is an open source project, so you can download the PCB schematics and you can order your own PCB or build your own PCB, however you do it. And you can order all the chips and components that go on here, and you can build it fully yourself. You can buy kits if you want to assemble it, but you don't want to kind of mess with the PCB and all the components. And you can buy them pre-made. And of course, given my soldering abilities, I always need to buy them pre-made. Seemingly, I wasn't desperate enough to open it, so it's not even open, but Grease Weasel. All right. Yeah, the next segment, I would like to go into the communication on the disk drive and speed loaders, but I just need a little interruption here. And while I make the interruption, why don't you subscribe, share, and like? I'll give you a few seconds to do that, and I'll be back after you have done that. So, looking back at the previous recording, I see that there are a few things I missed. The first one would be this. Today and the green screen is killing that, but I can tell you that it says Gubbdata we feel the need for tweed. So it's the upcoming party in Lund, first weekend of July, by Hedning, whom I think I basically mentioned in every episode. It's not intentional, but there is probably something subconscious about that. So the other part I forgot to mention is that I also have this interface. So this one is a cat weasel. It's not a grease weasel, it's a cat weasel. Jens Schoenfield individual computer is he did those, and they are really old. So you connect it using, I think this is PCI. The older ones could go both into a PC and also using the Amiga Zorro bus, probably via some sort of voodoo trick. I have no idea how he managed to do that. But this one so went into the computer, and then you would have a driver, and then you could work using like 1541 or standard Commodore format towards a PC drive. Normally a PC drive wouldn't be able to do that, but because of this you could read and write a number of formats, and this is not only for 5 1/4. You can connect 3.5-inch drives as well. And this one is also sort of built. There are a few additional aspects of this. You can connect 2 SIDs here, as far as I remember. And there was a special card called Hard SID for people wanting to play SID music without emulating SID music. And this is doing the same, but it's also supporting 2 SIDs at the same time. There is sort of this keyboard or a mouse connector. I don't remember what that is for, and I haven't read up on why that is, but again, it's discontinued since long. I haven't used mine in a long time, and you also need sort of an old piece of hardware to connect it, because normally a modern PC wouldn't have a PCI bus, so you need to have like an old piece of equipment to use this. Yeah, mine is for sale if you're interested. And the other part I forgot to show is that I, of course, have a 1581. So the Commodore's 3.5-inch disk drive. And at the advent of Commodore's lifespan, you had CMD producing compatible drives. So they had a drive which was compatible with this one. They also had one, but this one is only supporting DD disks. CMD, they also released one that could handle HD disks, which gives you twice the capacity at the same form factor. So, and I mean, those disks didn't cost that much more, and in effect, it actually cost less because there were a higher demand for high definition disks. So, eventually, the DD disks would cost basically the same or even more. So yeah, that was that. Now we should go into this segment on serial communication. So why make these breaks? Because I need to scroll in my script. Otherwise, I don't know what I'm supposed to tell you. So bear with me for interruptions such as those. Fast loaders, what they do is that they replace the synchronous transmission that takes place on the serial bus. So on the C64 there is kernel, which is sort of the operating system, and you have like a kernel also sitting in the disk drive. And there is a protocol implemented in the two that makes that communication possible. And it's a very slow one because it's communicating and it's doing handshaking between every bit. It's super robust to the level of ridiculousness. So the C64 runs on around a megahertz. A PAL computer runs slightly under, an NTSC computer runs slightly over, and the disk drive runs exactly 1 megahertz. But it's close enough that you could do asynchronous communication. You send several bits to the disk drive or receive several bits from the disk drive before performing a handshake to ensure that sort of the clocks align. That saves a lot of time because, I mean, handshakes for every bit basically means that you send bits back and forth for the actual handshake per bit. So the communication back and forth is times 2 or times 3 or even more than that. If you can handshake more seldomly, then you save a lot of the overhead for communication, the bit over the serial bus. But thing is that this asynchronous way of doing it, if there are interruptions, then the protocol isn't robust enough to sustain that. So if I look at a few of the aspects here, if you have bad lines on the screen, so the first pixel row of every new character line, and there are 25 character lines, that one is called a bad line. And the way the computer is designed is that if the VIC wants to do work, the CPU is locked out and it doesn't have access to memory. It's basically halted for the time that the VIC is accessing the bus. So what this means is that for the 63 cycle line, so every raster line, that's PAL, NTSC is different, but out of that, the VIC gets access to 40, one per character. So there are only 23 left. So if you are in the middle of doing a handshake-less communication, that means that you would run into problems, because suddenly you would have one party that starts sending or receiving and the other one is busy with something else and is not really ready to receive or send data. And then you would have issues and the communication would fail. So one of the reasons why you typically turn off the screen when you're doing serial communication is to ensure that there are no bad lines. Because if you turn off the screen, you have all the CPU would have all the CPU time. There is no VIC that interferes in that. But even if you have a routine that ensures that communication isn't initiated when there is an imminent bad line happening, you still have the issues of sprites, because a sprite steals 2 cycles, and that could be the 2 cycles that make your handshake-less communication go out of sync. So I'm using Lasse Örni's loader, and that one requires you to put a 0 in DO15, so turning all sprites off. If you don't do that and you have sprites on the screen, the loader will mess up. It's clearly stated, so it's not like you wouldn't know. It's just that it's sort of a known restriction of that loader. And also, if you get an interrupt request, an IRQ during loading, that could also, of course, mean that the communication messes up. So the inner loop should have a set interrupt and a clear interrupt to ensure that there are no interrupts happening during that handshake-less communication. One other thing is that there is a data line, and that is for 1-bit communication. And one of the things that is used, or one of the kind of techniques used for faster communication, is that you can use, I think it's the attention line. So you can do 2-bit communication. So again, without doing any handshake, you throw 2 relevant bits at the same time to speed things up. And of course, in the best of world, that would mean like twice the speed of communication, and also the gap where communication takes place is also shorter, which means that the risk of hitting a bad line is also less. So 2-bit transfer, but then you're not. But if you're doing this 2-bit transfer, you need special tricks to also do it in a compatible way. And most of the 2-bit transfer routines does not support sort of turning off all the other drives. So if you have a serial bus with a printer and a secondary disk drive, and if you try to run one of those less compatible 2-bit transfer fast loaders, then you are likely going to see load errors because of the issue that you would what you communicate over the serial bus will be interpreted by the printer and the secondary drive as commands, and they will start communicating on the serial bus as well. And then, of course, your loader will just be totally confused, and that would fail. So when you load a number of demos and you have 2 disk drives enabled on the system, you could sometimes see an error message saying that please disconnect the secondary drive because I only want 1 drive on the system when I'm running. And that reason, I presume, is because it's running a 2-bit transfer protocol. So how do you get serial fast loaders to work? Well, first of all, you could replace the kernel in the disk drive and in the computer, because then both the sender and the receiver are you have implemented a new protocol of communicating over the serial bus when you load or save, which should be faster than the original one. There is I'm not saying plenty of space, but I think the ROM in the disk drive is 16K, so I'm sure it's possible to squeeze in stuff there. The kernel in the disk drive is really squeezed, and there are not that many bytes left, and basically nothing could be used for anything productive. So what you need to do is remove something, remove functionality that is in the kernel. And predominantly what you do is that you rip out the tape routines, because if you have a disk drive and you are a heavy disk drive user, meaning that you would like the loading to be faster, then it might be that tape deck is not your your main driver. So then you could possibly live without the tape routines. One example of this would be the Jiffy DOS. That adds a lot of things to the kernel, and it also speeds up serial communication with all the disk drives, because it's changing the entire protocol. So it loads faster also with the 1581. So it's a super compatible and very nice speed loader. And if you have a kernel that supports or a Jiffy kernel, then your system would be a lot snippier in general. So it will be faster with any disk access you're doing. But if you're also planning to use something which is involving tapes, you probably need like a switch that turns back and forth between tape routines being in the kernel and not. There are also a parallel loading system, which was something I used a lot. I had something called Professional DOS. That had a new kernel in the 64, and again with the switch, so I can turn it on and off, physically turning it on and off. And then it had a little board inside the disk drive. It sat under, the CPU, I think. And then there was also, the parallel cable would go under one of the CIA or VIA chips inside the disk drive. And then you could have all the handshakes using the serial bus, and then it sent the data 8 bits in parallel over the parallel port. So those were a radical speed improvement to loading and saving on the 64. And they also supported stuff like 40 tracks, so you can use 40 tracks of your discs rather than the standard 35, which is also convenient if you wanted the extra space and you were willing to sacrifice the compatibility restriction that would sort of inevitably cause you couldn't send a 40-track disc to somebody else and they would be able to read it, because they would only read the first 35 and then it would error. So it would be for your internal work disks and other people who also supported 40 tracks default on their system. I think one of the things that those boards did was that they read an entire revolution of a disk, so an entire track into memory, which is sort of fine because you're supposed to look for the sector and you might as well read the entire track in there. And then when you load it, there is a high degree of probability that the next sector is already in the RAM. If it's on the same track, then it's probably in the same if it is in the chain of the file, they are predominantly placed on the same track until that track is full, and then you move on to the next track. So the probability that the sector you wanted to send over to the disk, if you're loading, was on that bigger buffer, made loading very much faster. I don't know if that made any sort of sense, but it was sort of caching an entire track, and that cache contained the next sector to send, or at least a high degree of probability that that was the case. Also speeded up the process a lot. Examples of this would be Dolphin DOS, Professional DOS, and yeah, there were a number of other. I'm not really sure that Dolphin DOS had like an extra board in the disk drive. I think it's more just something that loaded a lot faster without that. So it wasn't as fast as I remember it, but I could be wrong. The other way is a cartridge loader, and there are no real drawbacks to that one. It's the only potential drawback is that it eats, of course, the cartridge ports. So if you have something else like a RAM expansion unit, then you couldn't have that at the same time. During my active years, my Action Replay was sort of my predominant hacking tool, but when I coded, I wanted the Rio. And for that reason, I could not use the speed loader of the cartridge because they couldn't work at the same time. The Rio used DFOO, 10 bytes there. And that is also used by the Action Replay. So they couldn't coexist. This is one of the things that was sort of fixed in the Retro Replay, so that you could use Rio and Action Replay or Retro Replay at the same time. But that wasn't an option that was available to me at the time, which means that I used Jiffy to have faster loading, and then the RAM expansion unit for my coding sessions. But Action Replay is a super compatible loader. It works with all the disk drive. It speeds up everything. The way it works is that kernel, when it calls load, there is a vector down in low memory. So there is a range of vectors from 0300 to 0333, I think it is. And one of them would be load, one of them would be save, and then there are a few others. So Action Replay it replaces the calls of functions in kernel with calls to functions internal to the Action Replay. So that's how it wedges in. So if you want to use an Action Replay from your own code, you have to ensure that you don't sort of init the vectors, because if you init the vectors, the vectors are no longer pointing to Action Replay, and the speed loader in Action Replay is sort of disabled using that. Whereas anything that is in stock kernel is natively there anyway, and if you init it, then it's still there. It's just reinitiated and nothing really happened. The third option is to load a third-party piece of software. So if you load a little file and then you run that, and then that is sort of wedging itself into as an extension to kernel, and then you load something, and that loading is faster. But then you lost a lot of time loading that little boot file. So that's sort of mimicking the how you worked with tapes, where you had on every tape there was the first file was one of those Turbo 250 or Mr. Z Turbo or any of the other turbo systems for tapes, or you had a specific tape for that. So loading that speed loader so that you can load from the media in a faster way. Really inconvenient way of doing it, and Action Replay or any other cartridge is so much better than that. So I wouldn't recommend that at all. Yeah, and ST2IEC is also one of those external things that sort of mimics a 1541 drive, but it's only mimicking it on the sort of kernel layer. So it implements the communication between kernel and the disk drive. So if you want to load there is a way where this is communicated, and then the stream of data is sent from the SD2 IEC. But a speed loader replacing the routines also in the disk drive. So it sends in routines into the disk drive and executes them, so they become the new drive part of the communication over the serial bus. And then you have a receiving part, which is also there. Again, this is for the loading scenario. But an SD2 IEC does not emulate the disk drive. There is no way you can send something over because it doesn't have any like drive RAM. There is no way you can execute that, again, because it doesn't emulate and there is no RAM, so there is no program you could execute. So anything which is using a non-standard way of loading will work on an SD2 IEC. So if you want something that works on an SD2 IEC, you need to have something which is dedicated to SD2 IEC. It needs to be sort of specifically written for it, or it should be a function which is only using standard kernel calls. And if you looked at the hacked program of multi-levels, what we normally do is we have an IFFL routine or a speed loader that loads faster and also decrunch at the same time. So basically, if you're going to do byte by byte decrunching, you might as well throw in the speed loader there as well. And this is why sort of standard cracks never work with an SD2 IEC. And an SD2 IEC in general is sort of a controversial unit in the 64 community because it's not a compatible device. It's sort of a cheap man's or poor man's version of an external disk drive. 1541 Ultimate is doing so much more. More expensive, I get it, but if you want something that really works, you would like to stay away from the SD2 IECs. Unless you find it really interesting as a challenge to make something work on it. So when we hack programs, we take out the native loaders and we install our own loaders, typically with the decompressor in real time, so we don't need to load and decompress in memory, because that means that you need banks and buffers, which is rarely available when you're retrofitting stuff. And one of the challenges here would be produce something which is compatible with both the 1541 series of drive, the 1581 series of drive, but possibly also the SD2 IEC, just to ensure that you could do it. But if you're going for the SD2 IEC, don't have that much hope that hackers would spend a lot of time making sure that multi-loader programs are compatible with your equipment. Most people would be more interested in producing like a cartridge version, working on like a Kung Fu flash or an Easy Flash or something, because then loading would be instant. And yeah, so SD2 IEC, yeah, I know it's out there and it works for a number of applications, especially if you work on like single files, but multi-files, that's really not something we are keen to support. That was actually everything I had planned to talk about today. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you subscribed and liked and did all of that and shared with your friends. And yeah, do buy one of the FairLight t-shirts on redbubble.com, and do subscribe so we can meet again next week. Bye bye.